Welcome to The Creative Influencer, where we discuss all things creative with an emphasis on influencers. The Creative Influencer is hosted by Jon Pfeiffer. Jon is an entertainment attorney in Santa Monica, California, who represents influencers and other creatives. This is episode 5 of the 5th season of the Creative Influencer podcast. Today, we flip the script and interview Jon. This is Michael, and I work for Jon behind the scenes, editing and publishing the podcast. Today, I'm asking the questions. We talk about Jon's experience as an entertainment lawyer, his work with influencers and creatives, and his thoughts on the shifting landscape of social media. I am joined today by Jon Pfeiffer. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. That should be my line, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, we wanted to flip the microphone today. You are an entertainment attorney in Santa Monica.
I am.
An adjunct professor in media law at Pepperdine University.
At Pepperdine, I teach a media law class to the undergrads. It's a required class, so if you're a communications major, you're going to see me.
And of course, you're also the host of the Creative Influencer podcast.
Yes.
Listeners will recognize my voice from the introduction, usually. So you get a behind-the-scenes peek today. But maybe I left out the most interesting part of your bio, which is you are an admiral in the Nebraska Navy.
I am.
What is the Nebraska Navy?
Well, I like to tell people that the Nebraska Navy is undefeated. We've never lost a naval battle. But the flip of that is we've never won a naval battle because it's just an honorary thing. Kentucky will give you a colonelship. You're a colonel in Kentucky's whatever. Nebraska makes you an admiral in their Navy. And this was something I was given when I was in college by the governor. Wow.
So did you grow up in Nebraska?
I did. I grew up on a farm 15 miles outside of a town of 1,000 people, Arapahoe, Nebraska.
And how many people were in your high school class?
Not very many. I think it was 24. Wow. But about half of them I went from kindergarten all the way through my senior year of college with.
And so you grew up on a farm. What made you want to be a lawyer?
I grew up on a farm. You got to remember, this is pre-internet. So if you were on a farm, you were isolated. And I just wanted to be around people. And the answer to the lawyer part is it just seemed like something I'd be good at.
Well, so how did you become a lawyer?
How did I become a lawyer?
How did you become a lawyer? Walk us through that journny.
Yeah.
From farm to lawyer in Santa Monica.
The snotty answer is I went to law school, but I knew from the time I was in like a junior in high school, I wanted to go to law school. And back then, people would go straight through. The majority of people would go straight through as opposed to taking gap years after college. So in college, because I knew I wanted to go to law school, I applied right away, went right away, and then practiced in Denver, which is where I went to law school for 2 years. But my last year of law school, I met my wife, and when we were talking about what we want to do with our lives, she had been living in California at the time, and we agreed that after 2 years, we would look at California. Well, what I didn't realize, because I wasn't thinking, was it meant I had to take another bar exam. And after I took the second bar exam, the California bar, I was like, we're not going to look, we're going to move. And I realized I really like California because it doesn't snow where I live.
Which I personally am from California, so I think it's the opposite sometimes for me, where
well, I'm of the mind snow should be visited.
True. Well, so journey to Santa Monica, but you worked in Denver. You mentioned Was that in entertainment law, and how did you become involved in entertainment law?
When I was in law school, all I wanted to do was try lawsuits. So I worked at a small firm in Denver where I got to try some lawsuits my first 2 years of college, or first 2 years of being a lawyer. Moved out to Santa Monica, and I got to try a bunch more lawsuits. And as I was at a small firm, and I decided I wanted to try working at a big firm, an international firm. So my calling card was that I had actually tried lawsuits. And while I was at the big firm, a friend of mine second chaired a case with me, which means I was the lead lawyer. He helped me out preparing witnesses and things like that. He left the firm and went to work at a small entertainment company, then called Summit Entertainment. And that's when Summit had, I think, 7 people. And Summit eventually got $1 billion with a B in financing. They put out the Twilight movies. They then were acquired by Lionsgate, but that was in the mid-90s. And I started doing entertainment work, and it just grew from there. Because it's so much of it about who knows you and who likes you and who trusts you. And it just kind of grew because I realized I liked it. So I worked at growing it.
Well, and so your practice is mostly in entertainment law, but do you split your time, within that category? And how do you split that time?
About 40% of my time right now is representing influencers. So about 40% of my clients are influencers. I started doing that about 5 years ago, maybe longer. And I realized it's such a wild, wild west because the law is not settled yet. And it's a lot of fun because you're learning something, you're trying to learn the different platforms to keep up with the changes because they're changing every week. And just the deals are changing. So it's been a real kind of a resurgence because it's just so much fun practicing in an area that's cutting edge. I mean, litigation has never been cutting edge. I mean, it's back in the Old Testament they had litigation. But finally, I'm on a cutting edge practice, and it's just a lot of fun.
Well, so what's the difference between what you do for influencers versus litigation? And
Litigation
maybe I
is
can ask
just
that a different way. What do you do for influencers?
Well, I'll give you the answer is litigation is where there's a lawsuit or there's a dispute of some sort. So you're already in a fight. What I do for influencers is I try to keep them out of fights. I will look at their agreements. When a brand deal will come through, I'll look at it to make sure that one, it really tracks what we agreed to, but two, that whatever we're agreeing to are things we can live with. I mean, we're not giving away name, image, and likeness rights in perpetuity to where we're not getting paid for it. So a lot of it is, for the influencers, I'll look at all of their agreements, their brand deals. They all have merch. So I'll look at the merch agreements. Many of them have podcasts. So I'll look at their podcast agreements. Some of them have products in the stores. I have a couple clients that have product lines. So we'll look at all those kind of agreements.
So those are a lot of different kinds of areas that you work with influencers. What kind of law applies to them? It sounds like there would be several areas.
There are. There's a lot of just general contract law, just overlying it. But then there is intellectual property / copyright law when it comes to the rights of the different media they've created. And then there's the FTC, the Federal Trade Communication, on the rules that you must have certain disclosures with a video post on YouTube or live streaming or on a tweet if you're getting paid for it or you're affiliated, or Instagram. We try to keep them on the straight and narrow in compliance with the FTC. And that's kind of a moving ball too, a moving target, because there was one policy the FTC announced on their Twitter page. So you have to subscribe to the FCC's Twitter if you want to completely keep up.
Well, so I mean, with all those moving balls, how do you stay up to date on the law for influencers?
Um, Part of it is because I see several agreements every week. You see the evolution of what brands are trying to do. And then when you get a Google agreement, they are, by the way, the most onerous agreements you could possibly have. But you'll see what Google thinks is important. And then there are certain um, uh, email newsletters that I follow. One of them is Tube Filter. They will give news, and then there's certain websites that I'll go to just to keep up. But and you go on Instagram. I mean, as a consumer, you scroll. So so when I'm scrolling in line, I'm doing research. I'm not mindlessly killing time. Or you go on YouTube to see, how YouTube Shorts is working. All the different things they're announcing. You want to see that just by consuming, a lot of it is easy to keep up with.
Right. You want to keep up with the changes in the platforms too, and
So when they call out a certain deliverable, and then it's going to be supported by two Instagram static posts, a story, and I haven't seen them do Instagram TV, but at least you want to be familiar with what they're asking the client to do.
has there ever been a time where they've asked the client to do something that's been impossible, or
Yeah, there have been, and it's been largely because, in no disrespect to 22-year-old, 23-year-olds, but many of the people I'm dealing with have just gotten out of college. They're working at an ad agency, and they haven't been on the platforms. They don't know what is really possible or what isn't possible, and they certainly don't know what the law is, intellectual property law. So sometimes they'll ask you to do something, and if you did it, you would immediately be in breach of that agreement. But you have to be very careful how you explain that, because you don't want to offend them. Because how would they know? They didn't go to law school. But you kind of gently, well, what's your thought on that? Why do you need this? Here's what I'm thinking. So you kind of want to walk them through what your concern is, as opposed to just making changes to make changes.
right? Well, I mean, this is a good segue. I mean, we were talking about keeping up on the industry, which is also, it seems, of course, lends itself to what you do here for the Creative Influencer podcast. So I wanted to ask you about that, and how did you start the podcast, and how did you even get the idea for the podcast in the first place?
I have been a podcast consumer since the first iPhone. Largely because I transitioned from PC to Mac, and I wanted to just immerse myself in the Mac world so I knew how to use it. Because it seems obvious now, you pick up a Mac, everything, it works. Well, not if you've used a PC your entire career. There's just some conventions that are different. So I started to listen to a podcast called Mac Break Weekly. And I don't listen to it anymore, but I would listen to it on and off for years, because podcasts, for those podcast listeners, know that when you get to know the hosts, it's kind of like dipping in on an old friend and kind of catching up. And that's what got me with the idea of, wouldn't it be cool to take something that I really enjoyed, which was doing the influencer work, and kind of take a deeper dive by interviewing people in the field, until I got the idea. And then once from idea till actually launching it took a year, because the advice I'd have for podcasters is, now there's resources on how to start a podcast. Take advantage of those resources, because there's a lot of fits and starts about what works, what doesn't work, what platforms I should use, how I set it up, how I record it, where you put the recordings, all of those things that you have to work through the first couple times, so you know kind of what you're doing.
Well, see, I wasn't involved in that part of the podcast, so I know that was a long process.
I had an assistant that basically was working full time. She would do little else but try to help set up the podcast for a couple months. Now, it doesn't take that long if you want to start one now, but it sure did for us because we didn't know what we were doing. And then you come up with a logo. No, I want a different logo. Or no, I this intro. No, I want So you play with the format until you kind of finally get your stride.
Well, so I mean, you mentioned how you got part of the idea, but how did you get the idea for the topic, the creative influencer, and focusing on influencers themselves?
Well, I knew. I mean, I really liked the legal area. I really liked representing them, and I thought, I bet I could get to know even more about them and about that segment of in the entertainment industry, that being influencers, if I were to interview them, because everybody's going to be, they're a little bit different influencer, because there's so many different kinds of influence. For instance, one of our guests was Beto O'Rourke, and he was famous for when he was running for Congress and then Senate against Ted Cruz on how we use social media. Well, he uses social media completely different than Alicia Marie, who is a YouTuber. She creates YouTube videos, but you get a better feel for the fabric of what's possible when you expose yourself to how different people are using the media.
Well, and so you mentioned two of the guests that you've had, and how do you find the guests that you have on the podcast?
A couple of ways. One, I will ask guests if they know anybody that would be good for the podcast. I am now at the stage where I have people reaching out to me. I have a fair number of requests every week. People want to be on the podcast. And then I have my target list, of people. Wouldn't that be fun to have this person on the podcast? So it's easier to get guests now than it was at the beginning, because we have a track record. We're starting season 5, or by the time this airs, we will be in season 5. So it's the concept's been proven, the sense of, he's not going to do it for 5 episodes and then quit, which statistically, I think I saw a year or so ago that most podcasts end after their seventh episode, because people get on it and they realize there is a rhythm to it and there is work to it. I can't just start talking and have it be something people want to listen to.
Well, so that's a good segue to kind of the difficulty of running a podcast. And, is it, of course, it sounds like it is difficult and to make one well. Is it easier or harder than you expected? And, in which ways?
I'm going to say it's both. It's harder in the sense of, we put up transcripts of the episodes on our website. So I didn't think that through on how to get the transcripts done and have that kind of other support, the social media support for each episode. That just takes time. What's easier is the conversations. I still do a deep dive in each guest. I'll do as much research as I can. And with YouTube and Twitter and Instagram, it's pretty easy to do a deep dive. So I want to keep the questions interesting. But if somebody's online, they're probably pretty glib. So I remember sitting outside my first interview and being nervous because I assumed it was going to be a lot like taking a deposition, where depositions where you put somebody under oath in a lawsuit and they don't want to be there, and they don't want to answer your questions. But when I was interviewing this particular guest, it just flowed because she's so used to talking on camera that it was fun. We got into a real conversation.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I've, of course, as I put together the podcast, I hear some of the B-roll before and after, and I've heard guests say that you're good at this.
I should be. I ask questions for a living.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question was, how do you think interviewing for the podcast is similar to, asking questions in a trial?
I remember there was a legal commentator. He did these tapes on how to be better trial lawyers. And he said the number one thing to be a good trial lawyer is you have to listen. So many lawyers don't listen. They're looking down at their next question, so they don't listen to the answer they get. And I think that's the advice, the advice from trial work to podcast. So many times a guest will drop something in that it's like, wait, what did you just say? And you follow up on that, and it turns out to be really interesting. So the advice I would give is to listen. So that, it sounds so simple, but
Well, good advice. I mean, not just for podcasting, right?
yeah.
Now, I mean, shifting gears a second, I just want to ask you about some of the mechanics of the podcast. Pre-COVID, you would always do the interviews in person. I just wanted to think that kind of the gear you would bring, and this goes back to some of the things that you might have thought about.
I would bring each recording. I bring my microphone. I bring my computer. I mean, those were the two big things: your computer and your microphone. So you were a little portable studio you were bringing with you. And I had pre-COVID said, I'll never do an interview unless it's in person. Boy, have I changed my mind. Because yesterday I did an interview with an author from New Zealand. Now, there is no way I would have ever had her on the podcast if I had stayed to that same rule. So I'm finding it's so much easier to get national guests, international guests, because Zoom is so easy.
Right. But, and moving forward, sounds like that might be the focus, but,
it will be, because we have the videos now too. It used to be in the first season or two, I mean, in the early part of the podcast, we would put them up on YouTube, but it would only be the audio recording. Now we put up the Zoom video recording. So we have that too. And frankly, I think it's easier. I mean, I'm watching you and you're seeing me. Yes, it would be better if I were sitting across a table from you, but it's still pretty good.
Right.
I mean, especially if you have high-speed internet.
Which, back when, I guess this is kind of a looking back question that's appropriate now, because you won't be doing many of these in person, or as many in person. But what's one of the favorite places that you did an interview, or most interesting place? I mean, whatever comes to mind.
I'd say the most interesting was Ricky Williams's house. Because Ricky Williams is a former NFL player. He won the Heisman Trophy, and he's now big into cannabis. So it was kind of surreal being in his house, because I'm a huge football fan, where that part of his life is completely behind him. So that was kind of fun. One of the earlier interviews I did was the head of digital for UTA, talent agency. So walking in with all that gear, everybody was like, what's he doing? So that was kind of fun. But those are the two that stand out the most.
So the first season had just interviews and regular episodes. Then you started doing mini-sodes, which are a combination of questions that are sent in, and then topics that you've selected more recently to expand more about and talk more about. That being the trend now, how do you select some of the topics that you decide to really take those deeper dives and discuss?
I mean, this last season, a lot of the minisodes were about student athletes being able to exploit their name, image, and likeness. And the NCAA was changing their rules. They didn't know what they were going to do. There was a Supreme Court case against the NCAA. So and I, being a sports fan, I thought this is an interesting topic, at least to me. So that's how I picked a lot of the minisodes that were based on just topic that I picked. On the questions that come in, I try to pick them on timely topics. So that's another way I stay up current with things, is when I'll get a question in about a certain topic, I'll do a deep dive so I can learn about whatever it is I'm going to answer, and hopefully convey that in not as much time as it took me to do the deep dive. But that's the kind of the balance.
Well, and it sounds like an eye both to keeping up as well as informing your clients and listeners of this podcast.
And it has to interest me. That's the benefit of it at this point. So far, all the questions or the topics I've done, I found interesting. And hopefully, if I find it interesting, somebody out there will find it interesting, one of our listeners.
Well, so, given all of that, one of the burning questions in the back of my mind about your podcast is why you don't run ads. It's a very strange, it's not typical at all. So it almost is like your own little experiment, just to do the research. But anyway.
It's a great question. And I've been asked that by a lot of people, is why don't you monetize this? And I made the decision early on that it was going to be easier to get guests. Right or wrong, if that decision is the right or wrong decision, it'd be easier to get guests if they didn't feel that I was trying to monetize them. Because I've had on a couple of politicians, Will Hurd and Beto O'Rourke, that I didn't want them to think I was making money while they were giving their time. If that makes sense. And then some of the podcasts, because I'm a huge podcast consumer, some of the podcasts I listen to are so monetized. There's so many commercials. It's just, it's frustrating and it loses flow. So it was a combination of hopefully getting better guests because of it, and two, making it a better listening experience.
Right.
And I didn't set out to make money on it. I set out because it was going to be fun.
Well, totally shifting gears, but since you just mentioned it, you mentioned that you're a podcast consumer. And you also mentioned how listening to some podcasts gave you the idea for this podcast.
Right.
So two questions about that. First, of the podcasts that you listen to, do you borrow any particular style or, ideas from others that you listen to?
Somewhat. There was a podcast I listened to where they suggested if you're interviewing an author, you should read a passage from the book and ask them about that. And I have done that, and sometimes very successfully, and sometimes the author had no more to say about it than what he wrote in the book. But you live and learn. But so I borrowed that, and a lot of it. The other part I borrowed is I try to not edit the interview. So it's what you hear is what was really there, as opposed to a highly edited Malcolm Gladwell-esque product. Even though he is one of the podcasts I listen to, Revisionist History, because it's a great podcast, but it's highly edited, and you would need a team of people to be able to do that. So
more like a Joe Rogan experience.
Yeah, only shorter. Only shorter.
Have you ever, when you were in person, did you ever share a stogie with, or whatever it was that he would pass around?
He had. It was. I think Obama. Was it Obama? No, it was Elon Musk. He was smoking dope on the podcast. No, I don't. I've never done that on the podcast.
And then about the podcast that you listen to, you mentioned Revisionist History, but any others that are your favorite?
I have a couple others. I'm kind of quirky this way because I have like 20 of them I subscribe to, and I'll jump in and out. But the ones I listen to regularly are it's Reasonable Doubt with Adam Carolla and Mark Garagos. So it's a combination of humor and law, which is it's entertaining to me. Another one that's kind of niche is Storyworthy, which it is a storyteller that's won several Moth competitions. I think he's won like 50 of them, 45 of them. They'll play a story and then they'll analyze it after they play it on how the story was structured well and things they could do to improve the story. And it's just basically you're getting storytelling lessons without the pain of getting storytelling lessons. It's entertaining. And that's one I just kind of recently found. And then I still had the ones on tech, because at a certain level, I love the computers and I love the geeky part of it. But that's, you got to dip in and out of that. I can't listen to that every week.
Right. Well, I mean, something I wanted to talk to you about, but we kind of have to go back because you mentioned stories, and it reminded me. I wanted to hear not just about some of the interviews that you had with the creative influencer, but some of the fun stories that you might have had both with influencers themselves or other trials. I mean, anything that comes to mind. I wanted to talk to you about some
I'll
fun.
Give you an influencer story, and I'll give you a trial story.
Okay.
Okay. I'll start with the trial story. It was several years ago. I was trying it with an associate when I was still at the international law firm. And the jury's walking in, the client turns to me and says, "So how many times have you done this?" I'm clearly nervous. And I said to him, being a smartass, I said, "Counting this one?" And he said, "Yeah." And at that time, I think I said 40 or whatever it was. It was a lot. And unbeknownst to me, the second chair that was sitting with me, the young associate, the other client turns to him and said, how many times have you done this?" And Chris says, "Counting this one?" The client says, "Yes." And Chris said, "One." And to the client's credit, the client said, "Me too." So I always thought that was just kind of everybody's concerned about how much you've done it. And then the influencer story, and I'm not going to tell you the influencer's name, but he or she wanted to film themselves. I'm trying to keep this gender neutral. Wanted to film themselves being pulled down Ventura Boulevard by TikTok stars in their car. we talked him or her out of that. Because there's all sorts of things you don't think about. You're going to have to shut down Ventura Boulevard. You're going to have the police come to provide when you see film sets in their public areas. There's going to have to be security there. And set aside the number of people you're going to really piss off because you shut down Ventura Boulevard. But I thought that was kind of unique.
So I take it they didn't do it.
They did not do that.
Well, so, given your work with influencers, and some of those fun stories, that's, you mentioned that's only been for the last 5 years, and it has been a growing part of your work. Do you see that continuing to grow, and where do you see that industry developing, and how have you seen it? Maybe I should have asked first, how have you seen it develop in the last 5 years? And
it's gotten much bigger, and from all estimates, it's going to continue to get bigger because traditional media isn't as effective. I mean, it's like me talking about, I'll stop in on a podcast to listen because they're like old friends. With the followers of some of my clients, it's like following a friend, following a sister, a big sister, following a brother that you get to share in their lives. Even though you're not participating, you get to share and you feel like you're part of it. So it's much more, from an advertiser's perspective, it's much more, the return on investment's higher. And the industry estimates, if you look at the ad companies and the ad firms that track this stuff, they're predicting it's only going to continue to grow.
And I want to come back to your predictions in a second. But you mentioned that brands are only continuing to put more money in. Have you have you seen that that's, that more brands are coming to influencer marketing and that's becoming more mainstream now?
Yes, it is. I mean, because some of the agreements I'll be doing with, I've never heard as a company, in the sense of they're very new in the field, and they're frankly sometimes the hardest ones to negotiate because they don't know what is good for them. They don't know what's a good deal point for them. They're still kind of working it through. But I'll see companies that are new to the field, and then I'll see people that have been brands that have been in the space for a long time increase their spend.
Well, and does that mean that it's still in its infancy stage, or has, what I'm really getting at is the law aspect, and has that, do you think, matured yet, or is it still in its infancy?
It's in its infancy. It's because we have laws that really apply to TV and radio and movies and billboards that we're trying to pigeonhole influencers or YouTube videos in under that law. So it's still kind of shaking out, which is what makes it fun for me, is because we really don't know where it's going to go. I can predict, and that prediction is it's only going to be more regulated, but we don't know how it's going to be more regulated. We don't know what's going to happen with that.
And when you say we don't know, any indications, or it's just so unknown?
Well, pre-COVID, the FTC announced that they were going to issue new rules. They were going to have public hearings. Public hearings were supposed to be in July of 2020. They never happened. They were talking about making not just the influencer responsible, but the brand responsible and the advertising agency responsible, which would be a real change. And there would be a lot more compliance, I predict, if everybody in the food chain were responsible. And I think eventually we're going to get there.
Well, and before I talk about some of your other predictions, what I wanted to ask you, since you asked this of most of your influencer guests, is, and you might have a unique perspective on this now, is what you think it means to be an influencer.
Because my guests have been so diverse, from YouTube stars that they have, millions and millions and millions of followers and views, billions of views in some instances, to politicians, to people in the industry. It is, do people look to you, even if it's only one or two people, do they look to you and they respect your opinion? So you don't have to be on YouTube to be an influencer, although that's how, in the common parlance, that's how it's thought of. But if you are out and people are looking to you for guidance, or people are looking to you for some different view, then you're an influencer. I mean, if you're a rabbi, a priest, a minister, you're an influencer. If you're a lawyer, you're an influencer. Not in the traditional, boy, did you see my Instagram? But you still are.
Well, so how closely do you think the use of social media is to being an influencer? And that's become so closely connected, especially in your line of work.
Yeah, you don't have to have social media to be an influencer, but it certainly magnifies your influence. It's me walking out my front door and yelling to the world. Okay, maybe 2 or 3 people could hear me, and maybe I influence them, as opposed to going on YouTube, making a video, and 9 million people watch that video or more. So you're still an influencer, but social media magnifies your ability to get whatever that message is out.
So you use social media to promote the podcast.
We do.
And for your business as well, right?
We do.
So have you learned any lessons, so to speak, or taken any notes?
Yes. The lesson I've learned is patience, because especially we have an Instagram for the law firm. We have an Instagram account for the podcast. We have a YouTube account. We have a Twitter account, LinkedIn. All of that is more from my perspective. It's about being there to be found if people are looking for a lawyer in the field. The most important platform for me is my website. Because 5 years ago, if somebody would have called and said, hey, I Googled you and I found your website, it never happened. Now it regularly happens. I mean, it's several times a week. People will say, I found you on the internet. So it's important to be there, because I have friends that I know, colleagues that I know, they're not there. And now the opposite is starting to happen. If somebody Googles you and they can't find you, it's like all sorts of red flags come up. Is he a serial murderer? I mean, why can't I find this person? So you don't have to make your life being on Instagram or being on any of these platforms, but you need to be there.
Which is part of my question, and I wanted your perspective on, because it's not just because you work with influencer clients, then it's because of traditional marketing principles.
Right. I mean, it's traditional marketing. I mean, I pay more attention to it now that I have influencer clients, because I realize some people really pay attention to it. And I was asked one time what my favorite platform is, and I have two answers. My favorite platform for consuming is Instagram. My favorite platform for business is LinkedIn, because it just conveys different information. So I think my advice would be to, if you only have time to do one or two platforms, is to pick the one that speaks to your niche. If you're an influencer, pick the one that speaks to what your passion is and what you're going to be doing videos and posts about. If you're a lawyer, you get the same advice. Or if you're a doctor, same advice.
It just occurred to me, I mean, as you say that, in the brand deals that you see for influencers, do they tend to include all platforms in the kitchen sink, or do they focus on just the ones that the influencer is known for?
In the early days, they include everything. Now, if you do a YouTube video, there's always a required support on Instagram posts, Instagram stories. Some of the deals require TikTok. I haven't had a Snapchat where you have to do Snapchats for quite a while, because it's much like stories, because it just kind of goes away. There's always Instagram. And funny, in the early years, it was Facebook. There always had to be Facebook posts. Facebook isn't nearly as popular in the sense of requirement for brand deals as it used to be.
Well, so that's an interesting transition that you've seen, or evolution. What would you say, at least right now, are the platforms that are focused on most in the deals that you see?
YouTube is still king. I mean, YouTube is still king. Instagram is queen. TikTok is prince. Twitter is the Joker. And I kind of, tongue in cheek, but not really.
Well, okay. Segue to, I mean, and what I really want your opinion on is some predictions about this too. But I thought it was appropriate, since we've heard so many of your guests make predictions.
Right.
You've had some exposure then, and insight, both in hearing their thoughts, but in your day to day. So I wanted to get out your crystal ball.
Okay.
And look into it. So platforms, what do you think the next big platform is going to be?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers, but the one answer is if I knew, I'd buy stock now. But I'm going to give you the category of platform. I think it's going to be ideological. I think the whole Trump being kicked off of Twitter, I'm not even going to go there on what, on should they, shouldn't they, but I think the reaction will be there'll be ideological platforms for both red and blue in different causes. I see a growth in that. So like-minded people will find like-minded people easier. And you don't have to worry about terms of use for your particular view of things. In what form that's going to be, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's going to be Facebook groups. I don't think it's going to be, particular hashtag trending on Twitter, because you still have to worry about the terms of use. But I think there'll be platforms designed to different points of view, which is both good and bad. Because the bad part of it is like the people who only watch CNN or the people who only watch Fox, you don't know the other side. So that's the bad part. The good part is I don't know what the good part is, other than there's a market for it.
Well, to use your TV analogy, I mean, and what I want to get at is and think about with you is how this affects influencers. Would we have the same influencers advertising on all of those platforms, like running the same commercial on CNN and Fox?
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because most of the brand deals required you to be in your post apolitical, which means they don't want a political position. They don't want you to sniff at a political position. They don't want to offend either side. It's funny because they want unique personalities to sell their brand or talk about their brand on the one hand, but then they want a vanilla influencer on the other.
Well, and to put it in perspective, I guess you're not seeing the same kinds of goods advertised on cable news versus what influencers have. I mean, it will be interesting to see the day when we have an influencer hawking
a hearing aid
drug, or
well, we do have an influencer. Well, if you call Khloe Kardashian an influencer, she does the Botox or one of the migraine medicines.
That's right. That's right. That's a crossover.
Yeah. Like the Kardashians needed any more exposure.
Well, so do you think? I mean, actually thinking of crossover, it will become more mainstream. Do you think we'll see influencers in mainstream media as well?
They're going to try. They're going to try. There have been a few movies cast with influencers. The idea being is they have a fan base that can come and bring it to the movie. But and there will be a few successful doing that. But the reality is if you're a good YouTube star, you're probably not Glenn Close. There's a different skill set. So there will be some. I mean, it's just like The Rock was a professional wrestler, and now he's on screen. We haven't seen a lot of other professional wrestlers make it to big movies. So there will be some, but we won't see a lot.
Then I wanted to ask you about your predictions for some of the technologies that we're seeing. This is going back to a couple of seasons ago. You had Robert Kosnitz on, and you asked him about, and he gave some specific predictions about technologies like AR, augmented reality, or VR, virtual reality,
right,
artificial intelligence. And I know from listening to your interviews, that's been something on your mind in the past. So is it still? And where do you see that going?
It is, I think, as AR and VR get better, and they're so much better now than they were even a couple of years ago. There's going to be some sort of integration within YouTube or within Vimeo or whatever the platform is that's competing with YouTube, where you can actually have virtual reality or artificial or augmented reality in the video. So you could actually step in the video, walk around to see what that influencer is seeing, try out that product. mean, maybe we're years away, but they're working on it.
Well, and then you mentioned how the law is very much in its infant stage. To follow that. I guess my first question is, how far behind is the law? Is it 10 years behind? Is it 15 years behind? Is it
The
20?
joke is it's 10 years behind, but the technology changes every 2 or 3 years. So I don't think on this area the law will ever catch up.
But where do you see the law going? I mean, what's your
more regulation? I mean, just as I said before, I mean, there'll be more liability for more players. In many ways, it's an effort to rein people in. Which is funny because you want to rein them in on false advertising, but you don't want to rein them in so much if it infringes on the First Amendment. So there's going to be those battles. What can private companies do to regulate what their people on their platforms say? I mean, the Trump battle. That is the one good thing that came from that is it created that discussion. Because it's a discussion. You can't, I mean, I don't condone what Trump was doing on Twitter, so hear how I say this. But it's a discussion now is that we had a private individual say violated terms of use. So now let's talk about that issue. And let's put Trump aside. Let's pretend it wasn't Trump. Let's pretend it was Howard Stern. And when you reframe it, then you can have a better discussion as opposed to politicizing it, where it's like, well, okay, I didn't want to hear what he had to say, or I wanted to hear what he had to say. Let's talk about somebody that doesn't have that baggage. Howard Stern's probably a bad example, but somebody that is a name that you would want to talk about those policies.
Well, and mentioning Trump, what do you think is going to happen around that?
Well, he recently filed a lawsuit, which he's going to lose because it's just established law that right now the platforms with their terms of use can set the rules. If you violate the terms of use, you don't have a First Amendment right to be on Twitter. It is a private platform, and Twitter can kick off whoever violates their terms of use. So his lawsuit is dead in the water from a legal perspective. But from a pandering to his base perspective, it's already been successful. Because when Hillary and Trump were running, I made the mistake of subscribing to both sides' emails. Because I wanted to hear what Hillary was saying about Trump. I wanted to hear what Trump was saying about Hillary. And when you do that, I wasn't thinking ahead. It means that I still get both sides' emails. So I get all these emails. And Trump's take on all of this is he's turned it into a fundraising event. So even though legally, I predict he has a 1% chance of prevailing, but economically, it keeps him in the fundraising mode. Like he needs money to file a lawsuit. But so there are other reasons I think he filed that lawsuit.
Well, I mean, beyond that lawsuit, I mean, it seems you mentioned freedom of speech and First Amendment rights, as related to that. I mean, are there other legal rights that you think are at issue over the next couple of years, and what are they?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court held in a case called Packingham that it was a convicted sex offender that North Carolina said could not be on social media. And he went on social media when he got a traffic ticket to talk about Jesus is good because his traffic ticket got dismissed. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, you, the government, can't keep people off of social media because it's like the new stump in the park, where you get to stand up and talk and give your view of things. So the government can't keep you off, but the way the law is now, going back to Trump example, is the platforms can keep you off vis-a-vis the terms of service.
So it's less like the stump in the public park and more like a stage in a private, corporate business park, if you will.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I heard Adam Carolla describe it as it's like giving the guy in charge of the microphone the power to unplug you if they don't like you. So I think there will be some discussion about that going forward. But we have to get past the fact that it's Trump. It will take some time, but there will be discussion about that because there is the one thing Trump's lawsuit does have correct is that there is a lot of power in the hands of the technology companies. And it's just a discussion we should have about, are we okay with that? Should there be some regulation? And I don't know where that's going to come down, other than there will be further discussion.
Do you think the consequence of whatever regulation you see, happening, I guess, first, do you see that as a potential negative impact, or maybe specifically what could be negative to influencers, or is that even something that they should be worried about? Is that more?
I honestly don't think it's something they should be worried about because, I mean, for instance, Facebook has a policy you can't have nudity. Okay, not Facebook. Facebook probably has that policy too, but YouTube has that policy. Where there were other platforms, Vimeo and Dailymotion. I don't even know if Dailymotion still exists, but they allowed nudity. So it was a really smart business decision in their terms of use to not allow nudity because it made the platform more accessible to a broader audience. So I think from an influencer's perspective, it depends on where you are. If you're in the political influence field, you're gonna chafe at some of the rules. But if you are just doing brand deals in a health and beauty category, it's probably not going to affect
Well, shifting gears, since you do towards the end of your interviews, I want to ask the same quick fire 73 questions.
all la Vogue. Okay. It's not fair because some of the questions I ask, I know are like, what would I say? So go ahead.
Which the one that I think is your most unfair question is, what question do you ask to find out the most about a person?
See, I've actually thought about that question. The question I would ask is, do you like dogs?
Okay. And do you like dogs?
Of course I like dogs. Dog people are good people.
Is that why you would ask the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's kindred spirits. I like dogs. And if you don't like dogs, I mean, sorry, non-dog lovers, but that's a character flaw.
What question would you most like to know the answer to?
Oh. See, that's the one that stumps my guests too. I mean, I could go existential on what's the meaning of life, or I could go who's going to win the next Super Bowl. Because if I knew who was going to win the next Super Bowl, I could go to Vegas, put down some money now, and I'd be okay. So I guess that I'm going to do the cop out and say it depends for everybody. And right now, I don't have one that's been burning at me.
What's your first concert?
My first concert. It was a concert in Kearney, Nebraska. And I don't even remember the band's name. The one thing I remember about it was so loud. It's before musicians started to wear earpieces so they could have the words put in their ears or the beat put in their ears. I remember they had to cover their ears like this. They were all singing with their ears covered so they could have the right pitch as they were singing.
What's the best concert you've ever been to?
It's a tie. it would either be Bruce Springsteen, or when I was still living in Denver, I went to see Ashford and Simpson. Ashford and Simpson were an African-American couple that I loved. And the reason it was the best concert is there were 2 white people in the entire auditorium. So it was just so much fun to watch everybody just kind of let loose. And I love the music. So I was among like-minded people listening to this.
What's your guilty pleasure?
Law and Order. Law and Order. I can watch, with the exception of the first couple seasons, because I don't like that prosecutor, I could have Law and Order on in the background, even if I've seen him 5 times.
What's one talent that you wish you had?
I wish I could play the piano.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
Oh, arrogant lawyers. How's that?
That's good. And maybe we should leave it there.
We probably should.
So last question.
Okay.
Where can people find you on the internet?
At Pfeiffer, Pfeiffer, law.com. Or just Google my name, and I'll come up.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun. Get the shoe on the other foot.
That's it for this time. If you enjoyed our podcast, please write a review on iTunes and tell your friends to subscribe. If you have any questions about influencers or suggestions for future episodes, email them to Jon at Pfeiffer@pfeifferlaw.com. Thank you for listening.